And we're happy to welcome Ilene Rosenthal, recently retired as program director for the Alzheimer's Association of Maryland. And she's also a sister of our community to her sister, Joyce. So I'm going to mute myself so you don't hear my kids.
Well, thank you, Brittany, and thank you for inviting me to join you tonight. As Brittany mentioned, this is very near and dear to my heart. This is my sister Joyce, who was older than me, and I even had a brother who was 11 years older than me. So, as you can tell, my parents waited a while before going on to have more children, but Joyce was very special. I adored her, and everybody adored her. Like most people with Down syndrome, she was fun, she was gregarious, she just loved people, loved dancing, and just loved the world. And, I know that my parents were always worried about, what will happen and, decisions that they made ultimately. One of the things they did not expect was to be dealt with an Alzheimer's diagnosis. And she was in her 40s when that happened. But back when she was young, there was no such thing as public school. So my mom didn't drive. She had to learn how to drive so that she could take her to the bus stop because they didn't, the schools that you were able to pay for didn't have door-to-door transportation. So she had to learn how to drive so she could take my sister to the bus stop in the morning and then pick her up in the afternoon. But she was a treasure. And the other thing is she had diabetes. She was type 1 diabetic. And one of the story that sticks with me the most about her journey with Alzheimer's was when she went to get the insulin out of the fridge because she was able to administer her own insulin. And one day she goes to get the insulin and there wasn't any. So she proceeded to take out the syringe and almost injected herself with an empty syringe. But fortunately, my mom was with her and stopped her before that happened. But I can only imagine what the outcome could have been like if she had succeeded. So it was hard watching these changes because we weren't used to that. And and then ultimately she was with one of the local nonprofits that provided supervised living as well as supervised employment and daycare. But when she got to a point where being in the supervised living was no longer an option, we were very fortunate. We were able to get her into what was then the only memory care facility in the state of Maryland. It was not a thing in the late 90s. And so we were very fortunate. It wasn't near our home, but it meant everything to have her in a place that understood dementia care and could attend to her needs more than other existing long-term care facilities. But she really was extraordinary, and I know how families feel and the significance and importance their loved ones play in their lives, and how you do anything you can to support them and help them along with their journey and give them the best possible life that they can live. So I'm going to talk, some of my remarks tonight are going to be generic, just about the state of Alzheimer's. And I'm going to talk about, symptoms and treatments and diagnosis, but I'm also going to have some content that is specific to the Down syndrome population. So just to give you a general idea, I wanted to just share, how prevalent this is in the total population. So of those, I guess I can't really see you because I think that there aren't you don't have the ability to do a special character to let me know, but I would imagine those of you who are here have been affected in your families, know people who have, and so I'm assuming that you're like other groups that I talk to where, people don't really talk about it, but they know, it's generally something that most people are familiar with and have seen how it has unfolded in their own families, in their own networks. So we do know that there are over 7 million people living with Alzheimer's in the United States. And in Maryland, that's about, I think we have about less than 130,000 people that we believe are living with Alzheimer's. And about 1 in 3 older adults dies with Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. And we've done such a great job medically and in research addressing some of the other diseases that were often fatal, that as a result, we see death rates going down from so many other diseases, but that leaves Alzheimer's prevalence going up. And it actually kills more people than all breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. And we've also seen prevalence of heart disease have gone down over 20 some years, while deaths from Alzheimer's have increased significantly. Age is continuing to be the biggest risk factor. So as we rule out other things that used to present medical challenges for people, we're still left with, Alzheimer's now creeping up on so many people. It's an expensive disease. A lot of people don't realize that there is very little available to support people living in the community. There are programs that help provide support at home, but those programs tend to have wait lists. And then there's always nursing home care, which is a last resort for most families. I'm always so inspired and impressed that for most families that I heard from, their only goal was to keep their loved one home for the rest of their life or as long as possible. But so when people do spend down, they can become eligible for Medicaid, but that's not the goal most families have. If it was up to them, they would use those Medicaid dollars to keep their loved one, pay for care in the home. And, I'm all for that, and before I worked for the Alzheimer's Association, which was the last 12 years. I spent over 30 years working for the Department of Aging for the state of Maryland, and was involved in a lot of the planning and discussions and creation of home and community-based services that were developed in the last 25 years or so as an alternative for people who otherwise would have no choice but to go to a nursing home. These programs are great. There just isn't enough funding for them. But hopefully things will change in the future, because personally, as a taxpayer, it's cheaper to keep people at home than to place people in nursing homes. So if the policymakers truly understood that, they'd be a little more aggressive at increasing funding for those programs that allow families to maintain their loved ones at home. And so this is, again, just a picture of what this disease is doing, what it's costing, what caregivers, we have over 12 million caregivers in the United States. And in Maryland, we probably have over 200,000 caregivers. And if you could put a price tag on the value of the unpaid care, it would be over 413 billion nationally. So this is serious, and we really need to do better. We've come a long way, but there's always room for improvement. And we also know that people would want to see more medications to slow the progression, if not one day, fingers crossed, a cure, but that's a way off. But at least we do now have some drugs that are showing success in keeping people stable, giving people more quality years, and slowing down the progression of symptoms. So a little bit about the Alzheimer's Association. It is the leading organization that's accelerating research, driving risk reduction, early detection, and maximizing quality care and support. Our vision is a world without Alzheimer's and all other dementia. I always used to joke that I would love to lose my job when I was working there because they found a cure. Unfortunately, that didn't happen during my tenure, but there's a lot of research going on. The Alzheimer's Association is the second largest funder of Alzheimer's research in the United States, behind the federal government. So a lot of the money we raise goes directly into research. So a lot of people ask about, well, what's dementia? What's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So cognitive decline, I'm going to start with, is really, it refers to changes in memory or thinking or reasoning that are worsening over time. Some people have mild cognitive decline, or perhaps that might be the first symptom. And then sometimes it becomes more significant. But the word dementia is really, it's an umbrella term. It's not a diagnosis. But dementia really is a term that refers to loss of memory or other abilities, although it may not always, at least in the beginning, interfere with daily life. It is not normal. Too often people think that dementia is normal, comes with age. I've had people tell me when they've gone to a doctor and said something's not right, and the doctor's response was, well, that's normal for your age, when it probably wasn't. Maybe for some people, some of the things they're experiencing is, but it still warrants a further look. And so there are many different kinds of dementia. Alzheimer's is the leading kind. It probably accounts for about 60 to 70% or more of all dementia cases. But some of the other types of dementia include vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, there's frontotemporal dementia, and then there's other types. And it's also possible to have more than one type. Vascular dementia, of course, is related to high risk for cardiovascular disease. So, people that are dealing with high cholesterol or heart disease, things like that could have vascular dementia, and it could be combined with Alzheimer's. So everyone is different, but these are just to give you a general idea of the different types of dementia. So we're going to talk about Alzheimer's now, more specifically. So it is, like I said, it's the most common cause of dementia, and age is the greatest risk factor for Alzheimer's. But it's also important to understand it is not normal. It's not a normal part of aging. While most people living with Alzheimer's are 65 and older, it can also affect people who are younger. When someone is diagnosed before the age of 65, it's referred to as younger onset or early onset Alzheimer's. And these individuals may be in any stage of the disease. They might be in the early, middle, or late stage, often face unique challenges, especially when they're working or raising families. I've known people who were fired for performance issues on their job, and then they went to their doctor and had a full evaluation, and then got the sad news that they were diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So it's unusual. Maybe 5% of the Alzheimer's population is under 65, but it can affect people in their as young as their 30s, 40s, 50s. And it is progressive, which means it does get worse over time. In the beginning, memory loss may seem mild, misplacing keys, forgetting names. Like, if I were in person with you, I would ask you to raise your hand if you ever walked into a room and you said, where's my phone? What do I do with my phone? And I'd raise my hand too, because, yeah, we all have that issue. But for people with Alzheimer's, they might not know that their phone is actually in the freezer or in the trash can. So there may be some unusual outcomes. So it's not as simple as just forgetting a name or misplacing the phone. But as it advances, it does take away the ability even to hold a conversation, even recognize loved ones, or just respond in general. Or the early symptoms might be somehow you're getting these overdue notices and late fees from credit cards when your loved one said, I know I paid it, I know I paid it. And then that might be the early sign, because there are no other symptoms at that point. But as it progresses, it becomes clearer that there is something more significant going on. On average, people who have a diagnosis typically live for 8, maybe 10 years. Some could live as long as 20 years. So every journey is different, and every moment does matter. And that's why early detection is so important, because when it starts, it's usually very subtle and it's easy to dismiss the early signs. But if you or someone you love is experiencing memory changes or trouble thinking clearly, don't wait, talk to a doctor. Getting an early and accurate diagnosis is very, very important. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about Alzheimer's and Down syndrome. So people with Down syndrome are believed to have a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's, often having symptoms younger. Like my sister's symptoms started in her 40s, And it's due to that extra copy of chromosome 21, which you've probably heard about, which causes an overproduction of something called APP, or amyloid precursor protein. And, by age 40, the brains of almost all individuals with Down syndrome do have significant levels of what they call beta amyloid plaques and tau tangles. These are protein deposits that are in the brains of people who have dementia, but also people who have not been diagnosed or even don't have symptoms may have it. And in fact, this was only visible until about 25 years ago. This pathology was only visible in the brain in an autopsy. It wasn't even possible to positively identify this without having actual tissue samples, but newer diagnostic techniques, including PET scans, are able to see these protein deposits. But again, people can have them without any symptoms. There have been studies of people that live into their 90s and hundreds who have these, but have never experienced any symptoms associated with Alzheimer's. So it does vary. But despite the presence of the brain changes, even not everyone with Down syndrome develops Alzheimer's symptoms, although, the rate is much higher. And as with all adults, advancing age does increase the chance that a person with Down syndrome will see it. So although scientists don't know exactly what role the plaques and tangles play in Alzheimer's, most experts believe that somehow they do play a critical role in blocking communication among nerve cells and just disrupting the processes that cells need to survive. And then when the cells die, that causes memory failure or personality changes or just the ability to carry out daily activities. Now, it's the National Down Syndrome Society estimates that about 30% of people with Down syndrome who are in their 50s do have Alzheimer's dementia. But as the age goes up, when they're in their 60s, when they're 50% of people with Down syndrome in their 60s are believed to have Alzheimer's. And then, we think that the increased risk, like other health issues, associated with Down syndrome results from the extra genes that are present. And again, that chromosome 21, which is the one of greatest interest in Alzheimer's, does seem to, there is that connection there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about symptoms. And these are symptoms that are more common in people with Down syndrome, where there are going to be changes in overall function and personality and behavior. But some of the other early symptoms could just be this list, like less interest. You know how sociable they are and how much they love being with people. And if suddenly that starts to change, that could be a little worrisome, or less enthusiasm for normal activities, ability to pay attention. We see some changes there, or just more anxiety or more fear or, irritability or aggression when that was not something that you typically saw in your loved one. There could be sleep disturbances or general restlessness or even seizures that don't begin until they've reached adulthood. There could also be changes in how they walk and just how they're coordinated and just different levels of excitability that could be present. Now, if I was just talking to a general audience, these are the 10 warning signs that I would generally be talking about. The first is memory loss that disrupts daily life. Remember, I gave the example of walking into a room and saying, "Where's my phone?" or "What did I come in here for?" That's normal. But if it begins to impact daily life, like say your loved one is used to going to the bank and suddenly they get lost coming home from the bank, that's not something that would be normal because they've been going to the same bank for 25 years. And so that would be a concern. Or just general challenges in planning or solving problems, difficulty completing familiar tasks, and then confusion with time or place. Sometimes it may be January, but they don't wear a coat in this kind of weather. That would be pretty scary. just not realizing it's January when they may think it's August. Trouble with images, visual images, spatial relationships, maybe having difficulty negotiating steps, but that could also have a relationship to vision issues that are affected. And just new problems with words or speaking. I know people who are diagnosed, and while everything else seems to be without challenges, their biggest problem is getting the words out. They know what they want to say, but they have difficulty getting the words out. The words just don't come. Or misplacing things and not being able to retrace steps that we talked about. Judgment. We've seen some people fall to prey to scams or other things and not realize that, whereas before they might have known right away, don't do that, or don't click on that, or don't say yes to that, but sometimes they lose that ability. And then just general withdrawal from work or social activities, and changes in mood and personality are also not uncommon. So we're going to talk now about diagnosis. And, what we have is we have a number of principles related to person-centered diagnosis for people with Down syndrome. Most adults with Down syndrome will not self-report concerns about memory. So diagnosing dementia in a person with Down syndrome can be difficult because of the challenges involved in assessing thinking skill changes of those with intellectual disabilities. But there are some recommendations here that are, I think, very helpful. Like, there should be a baseline of adult function by age 35. We have been trying very hard to build medical protocols in for those people who are seen by their primary care doctor who are on Medicare. So that would be mostly people 65 and older. And it's been our recommendation for some time that they have in their annual wellness visit or their annual checkup, that there be some attempt to measure cognitive function. But so often the doctors are in a rush. And if the person doesn't say, I'm having a problem, they're probably going to skip that and not make that a part of the routine evaluation. But for people with Down syndrome, that is recommended by age 35. And ongoing evaluation of intellectual function and behavioral and social function is really important, because you can create a baseline and then have something to compare to in subsequent years to measure any changes. Also look at changes in daily functioning. If you do see some personality changes or less enthusiasm for activities and, social interaction, that could be a sign, something to really think about. And then also consider a professional assessment by a dementia expert if there are concerns. There are a number of cognitive tests that are used to evaluate thinking in adults with Down syndrome, but, there are also they shouldn't be the only way to measure it, but there are a number of tests that can be done in a very short period of time, a few minutes, that can, while they wouldn't provide a diagnosis on the spot, they would enable the healthcare provider to take a glance at cognitive functioning and then have something to compare to in subsequent years. And then the other important thing is, if there could be something else going on medically. So it's even more important to rule out other potential causes of some of the symptoms that people are seeing. That it may not be Alzheimer's. It could be a, vitamin deficiency or a thyroid problem or infection or something else. So it's really important to note these things. And then in general, when I'm talking to a general audience and when I talk about the importance of early detection, I also stress the importance of, again, paying attention to any changes that are observed with memory, thinking, behavior. You've got someone who's always been kind and sweet and loving, and all of a sudden that person is becoming argumentative and angry, and that's not normal. So that's something that is worth noting. And then, if you do see changes that are unusual for this person, it's really important to take some action, have a conversation, go with them to the doctor, or just talk to somebody so that, you can get a sense of what's going on. So I'm going to talk now generally about treatments for Alzheimer's. So again, while there's no cure, there are treatments that do have a positive impact on how the disease progresses. And there are also some non-drug options that can help treat symptoms. But again, my advice is always talk to your healthcare provider to learn more about treatments. But these new treatments have been shown in clinical studies that they're able to slow disease progression. So, in the absence of an actual cure, having more quality years and high functioning years is very important. And there are a lot of families that would choose this as an option, just even though, as you know, with every drug, there's always a downside. Even though it may work well for 90% of the population that was studied, there could be the outliers that have an adverse reaction. So it's always important to consider all of this. And then there are drug as well as non-drug options that could treat symptoms. And then again, everybody experiences this differently. So got to really think about what might make sense for the individual before making any decisions. So now I want to talk a little bit about treatments for people with Down syndrome. And although the US Food and Drug Administration, there are drugs that have been approved, they have not approved some of them specifically for dementia associated with Down syndrome. Now, in the UK, there are these cholinesterase inhibitors, which is a type of drug used to address some of the symptoms in many other countries. But they haven't been approved in the US for Down syndrome, the Down syndrome population. And even in a series of studies and international experts that have evaluated the effectiveness of these drugs could not find enough evidence to reach a conclusive outcome on the benefit of these drugs for people with Down syndrome. There's another drug that's often provided to people with Alzheimer's called memantine, but the studies have not shown any real benefit for the Down syndrome population. So there may be many differences in the way people with Down syndrome process medication. So it's always important to be cautious and to really talk about this with your medical professional because the most important thing is that your loved one is safe and you don't want to take any chances that could cause more adverse outcomes. Now, people frequently will ask about clinical trials. So the National Institutes for Health has funded a large network to develop a clinical trial platform specifically for individuals with Down syndrome to better support the innovation and recruitment of participants in these studies. The network is based at the Alzheimer's Therapeutics Research Institute, which is with part of the University of Southern California, USC. And as you can see from this map, the network is global, although there's always an opportunity to further expand. You're probably looking like I looked at the first time I looked at this map, and there's no stars in Maryland. Hopefully there will be more opportunities for clinical trials closer to us in the future. Network is also working to develop a trial-ready population of individuals, meaning that these are people who've raised their hand, expressing their interest in clinical trials, so that we can hopefully accelerate the timeline for these studies and have answers one day about safety and efficacy of potential treatments. There are two ongoing trials, ABATE and Aladdin, that are targeting different parts of the amyloid beta pathway in people with Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease. And then there's another trial in the planning that will use a new technology, that's where it says coming soon on the slide, known as siRNA, and that's to reduce the expression of beta amyloid. So there's still hope. I'm sorry, there's no studies right here in our area, but it's not something that is being ignored. So I also want to talk a little bit about brain health because wherever I go, whenever I talk to anybody, we have more information now about modifiable risk factors. So I would feel like I wasn't doing my job if I didn't talk about some of these before we end tonight. So in most cases, there are very complex factors that affect brain health. Some are not modifiable. Those are the things we can't change, like age, which continues to be the biggest risk factor, genetics, and family history. But there's more evidence than ever before on modifiable risk factors. And that's what are those things we can change? What are those behaviors? What are those health lifestyles and changes that have been shown? And so what we do know is there's general agreement that there are roughly 10 healthy habits that are good for your brain. Obviously, anybody who rides a bike or motorcycle needs to wear a helmet. Again, smoking. I like to refer to this whole campaign as our version of the smoking cessation campaign, because if we could say it loud enough and talk about all of these healthy habits to enough people over and over and really inspire people to take control of their health, I really believe we could get the prevalence of dementia down. I didn't mention this, but Maryland is considered to have the highest prevalence of dementia in the United States. And in particular, Baltimore City is tied with Bronx, New York, and Miami, Florida, for the highest prevalence of dementia among people in towns that have at least 10,000 people age 65 and older. So while we want to be first in everything we do, we don't want to be first on this list. So this is really the roadmap to help getting that prevalence down and to talking about these things. And obviously, no one person is going to say, all right, I'll do all 10, but, or it could be taking one bite at a time, doing one little thing at a time. But obviously, moving, fitness, it's not rocket science that anything that obstructs the flow of oxygen to the brain can cause dementia. And that could be high cholesterol, or it could be cardiovascular disease, or other diseases that do that. Obviously, blood pressure, I just mentioned, diabetes, managing diabetes, getting enough sleep, staying in school or continued learning, lifelong learning, even for those who are not in school specifically to earn a degree or to trade, to learn a new skill. Just learning, taking classes, keeping your mind fit, challenging yourself intellectually. Diet. Diet is really important. There's more evidence. I'm going to talk about a special study that was just released it's about 6 months ago on this. And then weight. So the study I'm referring to is called the U.S. Pointer Study. And this was the very first large scale trial in the United States that really did a deep dive to evaluate whether addressing these lifestyle factors, specifically diet, exercise, and cognitive stimulation, can protect cognitive function in adults who are at increased risk for cognitive decline. So in this U.S. Pointer study, there were over 2,000 people who were enrolled, and half of them were in a group where they had to follow a very strict format. They agreed to follow the Mediterranean type diet. They agreed to a certain amount of exercise every week. They agreed to cognitive stimulation. They had a coach. And then there was the other half that they knew what these interventions were, but they weren't required to commit to a specific number of minutes or a specific diet. And so at the end of 2 years, and the people who were selected in this study, again, over 2,000 people, the people who were selected were people who did not have dementia, but were considered in a high risk category, either because of their age or because they had some cardiovascular conditions or some other risk factors. And at the end of 2 years, both groups came out as though they were a couple years younger than their biological age. But what was most fascinating to me, because I watched the press conference they held at the research presentation, and one of the participants who was in the controlled group that had to follow the specific diet and exercise routines talked about her experience with it over 2 years. And she talked about how she lost 30 pounds, and that wasn't even a goal of the study. But by following the diet and exercising, she lost 30 pounds. Her waist at the end of the study was 11 inches smaller. And she said for the first time in a long time, her cholesterol, blood pressure, and blood glucose were all normal, and she was no longer experiencing chronic pain. Well, this Mediterranean diet is considered to be anti-inflammatory. So she is like a living tribute to what these lifestyle factors can do for someone. And she felt that this is so important. She said, I got to tell everybody, starting with my family. So this is the kind of thing, if we could get the word out, talk to enough people, again, it's never too early and it's never too late. So we need to say this to younger people and we need to say it to older adults. It's again, it's never too early, never too late. But this study showed really some really good outcomes in terms of the impact that these this can have. So this is the recipe that we call it the recipe for the US Pointer study, the brain health recipe. So it talks mostly about, the exercise, 30, 35 minutes of moderate or more aerobic activity 4 times a week, cognitive exercise. So they did computer-based brain training programs 3 times a week. But again, it could be something else. It could be reading. It could be playing mahjong. It could be, going to a lecture, going to your senior center, taking a class, just for the pure joy of learning. Nutrition, they followed the MIND diet, which is largely a Mediterranean diet, focusing on, dark leafy greens, berries, whole grains, and, fish and limited sugar and unhealthy fat. And so this was what we called the structured lifestyle intervention. And the results were extremely favorable. And it really, I think if anybody were to listen to this, it could inspire a lot of people to make some changes in their own life if they wanted to make sure that they could reduce their own risk for cognitive decline. So I tell everybody that again, you heard me say it before, it's never too early, it's never too late. Take charge of your brain health. There are several risk factors, and some like we can't control, like we can't control age, but there are things we can do to improve our brain health. And given the evidence now, especially from the US Pointer study, it's obvious that healthy living does have the potential to lower the risk of cognitive decline and possibly dementia. So these are all really important that, we got to just tell everybody every time, everywhere, every group, so that people can really take this in. And again, I call it our version of the smoking cessation campaign. So before we leave, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Alzheimer's Association resources. So if you take nothing away from this, make sure you know there's a 24/7 helpline. That number, 800-272-3900, is free. You can call 24 hours a day and talk to a live person. It could be something as simple as, do you have a support group near me? How can I find a support group? Or my loved one was just diagnosed. I want to learn more about the disease and how it progresses. Do you have education programs in my community? Or maybe somebody wants to get involved in clinical trials. And so Trial Match is a service where you can create a profile. And then if there is a clinical trial in your area where you would be a match, they let you know. And then you can decide at that point, excuse me, if you want to take the next step. It's completely optional. But, again, there are many resources that are offered and they're all free. So I highly encourage everybody to hold on to that 800 number, because if you don't have anybody in your life right now who's dealing with this, you probably will know people in the future. And then the Alzheimer's Association is always looking for people to get involved, whether it's to form a walk team or to become an advocate. We have a huge network of advocates, as I'm sure the Down Syndrome Association does, and nothing happens in a vacuum. And, when you talk to people who are policymakers in Annapolis or Washington, D.C., they know what issues are top of mind for their constituents because they keep track of the different phone calls and emails and letters that they get. So if they hear from enough people that you need to have more research funding, you better believe they're going to put more emphasis on research funding. Or if there's another policy issue, if there's something else going on. The longest day actually is now called Do What You Love to End Alzheimer's. And that's for people who maybe they don't want to join a walk, but maybe they just want to, they have a like maybe they want to do a golf tournament, or they want to create a pickleball game where everybody donates a certain amount and the proceeds go to the association. But there's lots of ways people can get involved. They're always looking for volunteer educators and volunteer support group leaders. So I just wanted to share that with you. Um, and again, get involved, consider clinical trials, get involved in fundraising, become an advocate, or get involved on the program side. So I just want to thank you so much for being here today, for listening to me. And I'm happy to have this opportunity. As you know, this is very near and dear to my own heart. I have fond memories, of my sister. Went to an event that the Down Syndrome Association had in December, and it was just so heartwarming for me to be around families and their Down syndrome children. And so I really have great respect for the work you all are doing, and appreciate being a part of it.